One night I was on my usual shift, zipping through the city streets to deliver piping hot pizzas to hungry customers. Little did I know that this particular delivery would be one I'd never forget. As I was nearing the end of my shift, I received a new order. The customer's address was in a neighborhood I hadn't been to before, and the instructions were rather peculiar. The customer had left a flirtatious note, making me slightly uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as just a harmless attempt at humor. When I arrived at the address, my unease intensified. The neighborhood had a gloomy atmosphere, and the streetlights seemed to cast eerie shadows on the worn-down buildings. I hesitated for a moment, but reminded myself that it was just another delivery, and I should get it over with. I parked my car and walked up to the door of the customer's apartment. As I knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a disheveled man standing on the other side. The pungent smell of alcohol wafted from inside the apartment, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The man greeted me with a leering grin and invited me inside. My instincts told me to decline, but I didn't want to be rude or lose my job, so I cautiously stepped inside the dimly lit apartment. As I handed him the pizza, the man's behavior grew more unsettling. He made inappropriate comments and tried to engage me in awkward small talk. I felt trapped and desperately wanted to leave, but something held me back, fear and the realization that I was alone with this stranger in a secluded place. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I started to hear strange noises coming from the other room. It was a low, guttural sound, and my heart pounded in my chest. I mustered the courage to ask the man about the noises, and his face twisted into an eerie smile. "Oh, don't mind that. It's just my pets," he said casually. Pets? The sound didn't match anything I'd heard from any animal before. Panic surged through my veins as I realized that I had to get out of there, fast. I managed to stammer out an excuse about needing to get back to work and quickly turned to leave. The man didn't protest, and as I hurriedly made my way towards the door, the noises from the other room seemed to grow louder, almost as if they were getting closer. I didn't dare look back, and once I was outside, I broke into a sprint. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car, my heart still pounding in my ears. As I drove away, I vowed never to return to that neighborhood again. I reported the strange encounter to my manager, who assured me that I wouldn't have to make any future deliveries to that address. To this day, I shudder at the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts and escaped that apartment. It was a dark and stormy night, and I had just received an order for a dilapidated house in a neighborhood I had never been to before. The address looked odd, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. As I drove down the narrow, winding streets, I noticed that the houses in the area were all old and run down. The neighborhood seemed deserted, with only a few flickering streetlights to guide my way. I started to wonder if this was a good idea, but I needed the job, so I kept going. When I finally arrived at the address, I was met with a sight that sent chills down my spine. The house looked abandoned, with broken windows and a crumbling facade. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and there was an eerie silence in the air. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether I should just leave, but my need for the tip pushed me to get out of the car. As I approached the door, I noticed a figure in the shadows nearby. It was a man, and he appeared disheveled and unkempt. He was just standing there staring at me, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I quickly knocked on the door, hoping to get the delivery over with as soon as possible. To my relief, the door creaked open and a disheveled man stood before me. He had a wild look in his eyes, and he seemed out of sorts. He grabbed the pizza from me, muttering something I couldn't quite understand. I tried to make a quick escape, but that's when things took a terrifying turn. As I got back into my car and tried to drive away, I realized that my car wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it back, and panic started to set in. I frantically tried to start the engine again and again, but it was no use. I was trapped. That's when I saw the man from earlier approaching my window. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my hands trembling on the steering wheel. He tapped on the glass, and I rolled down the window just a crack, hoping to reason with him. He leaned in, and I could smell the stench of alcohol and decay. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had this menacing grin on his face. "You're not going anywhere," he said in a low, threatening voice. My heart sank, and I knew I was in real danger. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I mustered all my strength and hit the gas pedal with all my might. The car lurched forward, and I felt the resistance give way. I didn't look back as I sped away from that nightmarish scene. I called the police as soon as I was a safe distance away, and they assured me they would check it out. I never found out what happened to that man or why my car had stalled. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter, and it left me shaken to my core. From that night on, I became much more cautious when accepting deliveries to unfamiliar locations. I learned to trust my instincts and prioritize my safety above all else. It was a usual evening, and I was out on my usual delivery rounds. Everything seemed pretty normal until I received this order for a house that was way off the beaten path. The address was in this secluded area, surrounded by thick woods, and the GPS was taking me down this eerie, winding road. I remember thinking, I hope this is worth the tip. As I got closer to the destination, the atmosphere grew even more unsettling. The tall trees seemed to lean over the road like they were reaching out to grab me. The streetlights were few and far between, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Honestly, it felt like I had driven into a horror movie. Finally, I arrived at the house, and the first thing I noticed was how secluded it was. There were no neighboring houses in sight, and it made me feel even more isolated. I parked my car in front of the house and took a deep breath, gathering my courage to walk up to the door. As I approached the house, I noticed that the lights inside were on, and I could see a figure moving around through the curtains. My heart started to race, and I felt this weird mix of fear and curiosity. I rang the doorbell and waited, and that's when I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming closer. The door creaked open, and there stood a man who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in ages. His clothes were disheveled, and he had this strange glint in his eyes. His smile seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about him. He greeted me warmly and said, "Hey there, come on in. I've made some delicious pastries, and I'd love for you to try them." The way he said it, with that overly friendly tone and a little too much enthusiasm, sent shivers down my spine. I politely declined, saying that I had other deliveries to make and couldn't stay. But he was persistent. He insisted that it would only take a few minutes and that he would give me a generous tip. It was like he was trying to tempt me into his trap, and I felt my unease growing. I tried to be firm and declined again, but he just wouldn't take no for an answer. He kept insisting, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I started to think about all those scary movies I had watched, where unsuspecting victims were lured into dangerous situations. Was this going to be one of those stories? That's when I decided to act fast. I pulled out my phone, pretending I had a call. I acted like I was listening to someone on the other end, and I said, "I'm really sorry, but I have to rush to another delivery right now. I'll have to pass on those pastries, maybe next time." It was a desperate attempt to get out of there. To my relief, he finally backed off and let me go. I quickly walked back to my car, trying to keep my composure. As I drove away, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. It was like I had escaped a close encounter with danger, and I was grateful to be safe. When I got back to the busy streets, I let out a sigh of relief. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had given in to his invitation.